Good morning. Today I want to make 3 points on these readings. I focus on healing and then apply those 3 points to our own lives today and how God wishes to bring healing into our hearts. So the first point, it took faith for these lepers to come to God for healing. Israel in the time of Christ was filled with lepers. It was a common disease, and it was one of the worst that you could contract because you were excluded from the society of those days if you were a leper. You had to be set off to a different place. You couldn't come close to anyone because you would spread the disease. And worst of all, you were excluded from temple worship. And that's why when these lepers come to Jesus in our gospel today, they cry out from a distance because they're not allowed to come up close to him. But it took faith for them to even do that. They had to believe that somehow this miracle worker, Jesus, would do something. And think about all the lepers who were not there, who didn't have that faith, who perhaps stayed home and just didn't bother because they didn't think anything could be done for them. In a similar way, in our first reading, this is way back in the Old Testament, centuries before the time of Christ, we hear about the pagan king Naaman, who also was a leper. He comes to the prophet Elisha to be cured. Well, we didn't hear sort of the backstory to this. The pagan king Naaman had a little slave girl who was from Israel, and she was the one who told him, "Go back to my homeland. There's a prophet there who can heal you." And so he does. He gets his whole entourage and he comes all the way to where Elisha is, and he asks for healing. But it took faith to do that. And if these men did not have that faith, they would never have even come to the Lord to ask for healing. So now our next point. Often God heals in unexpected ways. So in the few verses right before our reading from the book of Kings, our first reading, what we didn't hear today is that Naaman initially was upset with the response that he received from the prophet Elisha. So Naaman comes, he has his whole entourage waiting outside of Elisha's house, and Elisha doesn't even bother to come outside to greet him. He just sends out a little messenger, and the messenger says, "Go wash in the river Jordan 7 times and you'll be cured." And Naaman sort of storms off all upset. And he begins to leave. And his servants come to him and they say, "Master, what's wrong?" And he says, "I thought that Elisha would come out. He would call down the power from God on high. And he would wave his hands over me and do this dramatic thing. And then I would be healed. But here I come all the way out here. And all he says is, 'Go wash in the river Jordan.' I've got rivers back in my homeland. I could have done that there. What is this?" But his servants sort of cajole him into doing it anyways. And what's the worst he has to lose? So he does. He goes and he washes in the river Jordan, and that's what we heard today. And immediately, he's healed. So it was not the way that he was expecting. Well, let's go back to the gospel. These lepers come to Jesus. They ask him to heal them. And probably they were expecting something similar, that Jesus would say some dramatic words, that maybe he'd extend his hands over them, that maybe there'd be lightning bolts from heaven or something. But Jesus doesn't do any of that. He simply says, "Go off to the high priest." Just imagine the surprise that they must have experienced in that moment. "What? Jesus, you're the healer. Aren't you going to do something?" He just says, "Go off to the priest." And they go, and as they're walking, maybe they look at themselves and all of a sudden they realize they've been cured, they've been healed in a way that they were not expecting. And the reason why Jesus told them to go to the high priest is under Mosaic law, if you were a leper and you were cleansed of your leprosy in one way or another, you had to go to the high priest and he would examine you and then make a declaration that you were indeed free from leprosy, and then you would be welcomed back into the worshiping community. So in both of these situations, God healed in unexpected ways. And now the last point. The danger of wanting only healing and not Jesus. In our gospel, 10 lepers were cleansed, but only one returned to Jesus to thank Him and to praise God for this great gift. So you could say of those other 9 that they just wanted their healing. They weren't really interested in a relationship with Jesus, and so they didn't bother to come back. So now let's apply these 3 points to our own lives today. So first, that it takes faith to come to God and ask for healing. And this is absolutely the case for us today. If we don't believe that God will heal us, we're probably not going to come to Him and ask for that. But even beyond that, I would say that a particular problem in our own day is that we don't even recognize our own brokenness. Now, obviously, with physical illness, it's much more obvious, but in terms of brokenness of the human heart and woundedness from difficulties from our past or our family or whatever it may be, it's very easy to kind of gloss over all of that and think, I'm doing fine. I don't need any of that. I don't want to go there. I don't want to bring Jesus there. I'm fine. And we can deny the leprosy present in our hearts. And I certainly was in this state of mind when I was in college seminary. So right at the end of high school, my whole family life back home began to completely unravel. My parents separated when I was 16, and there were other things that went on then, but that was sort of the beginning of this total collapse of the world around me as I knew it. And after graduating from high school, I went off to college seminary, 10 hours away in Minnesota. And in retrospect, it was such a blessing to be pulled up out of the mess that was going on back home and dropped off 10 hours away, just kind of away from it all, just to grow up a little bit, and above all, to heal from a lot of the woundedness I'd gone through. But when I was first in college, I didn't think I was hurt. I thought I was fine. I'd completely convinced myself that despite all of the problems back home, that I was doing okay. Now, thankfully, we have a bishop who is very interested in the well-being of his seminarians and takes the time to get to know them. So he was aware of what I'd come through in high school. And so when I was in college, seminary, he strongly encouraged, or as someone say, he voluntold me to go to counseling. So I sort of begrudgingly went along and initially just didn't really think it was doing anything. It was a waste of time. And that was where it began. But then on top of that, in seminary formation, there were all sorts of opportunities, healing retreats and spiritual direction, and different ways that the healing touch of God could come into our hearts as seminarians. But it took that willingness to first acknowledge my own brokenness to start going down that road. And if I had never done that, I never would have experienced the healing that God wanted for me. So that's the first point, that it takes faith, it takes willingness to acknowledge our brokenness for God to do something. And now the next point, that God heals unexpectedly. This was certainly the case in my life, especially in that time in seminary. I was expecting there to be like this dramatic moment at some point. I'd sort of like reach a breaking point when God would just break through and I'd have this profound experience and there'd be weeping and everything would be fixed and I would be totally good to go from that point on. But it just didn't happen that way. And for whatever reason, God doesn't seem to work that way in my life. In my life, it's always very gentle, slow, a gradual process of transformation. And so, because it was so gradual and slow, I didn't think anything was happening in my heart as I was going through all this. But then I began to realize something very terrible was happening. Every time I went home during college, as I was reconnecting with family and all that, and trying to address some of those areas of woundedness and rebuild relationships there, something would happen. It was like a switch would get flipped. And as I was opening my heart and trying to restore these things, I would just start weeping uncontrollably. And I don't know if you've noticed, but I'm a little bit of a stoic personality. I don't really cry very often. So the fact that this was happening was very distressing to me. I was like, what is wrong with me? I've never seen someone cry like this. At least that's what I thought. Until that one time that I made fun of North Dakota too much in front of Father Brian, and then I saw someone else unload a little bit. But what was beginning to happen in my heart is that as the Lord was bringing healing through those relationships in my family and that gift of tears or whatever you want to call it, the Lord was truly transforming my heart and opening up all those places of woundedness and bringing His grace and His healing touch. But it wasn't in a way that I expected. And this brings us to the last point. The danger of wanting healing, but not Jesus. And this is something that any one of us can fall into. We can have this desire to come to the Lord, to get something out of Him, to experience relief or healing or whatever, but then to just move on from there and not really have any interest in drawing closer to the Lord through that experience. But the problem is, sometimes we will use that fear or that danger as a reason to not even come to the Lord to ask for healing. So some people say, I don't want to fall into that pitfall, and so I'm not even going to ask the Lord to heal me. But that's a little bit like, let's say you were in a town with a hospital and you had this illness, and the hospital had the means to bring healing into your life, but you refuse to go to the hospital because you're afraid maybe a doctor will make a mistake or there'll be a misdiagnosis and something could go wrong. And so I'm not even going to go. I'm just going to sit here and live with the illness and just make the best of it. No. Jesus is inviting us to come to Him, to experience His healing touch. And yes, it's possible that we can slip into just wanting the healing and not really wanting Jesus. But let's just be aware of that and try to resist it if we find it happening. But certainly, let's not allow that to keep us from coming to Jesus. As you may know, we've had it in our bulletin and on the website, there's this healing retreat coming up in the first week of December. It's called Healing the Whole Person. It's the same retreat we had a year ago. It's led by Dr. Bob Schutz and his team from the John Paul II Healing Center in Tallahassee, Florida. And this is an excellent opportunity for a whole parish to come together and to bring these areas of woundedness in our hearts so that Jesus can bring His healing touch. It certainly isn't the only opportunity for this, but it's a very good one. I mean, Dr. Bob Schutz goes all over the country giving these retreats. He's the guy that's so good that even seminaries will call him in and he'll come and do these retreats for seminarians, men in formation for priesthood, because it's done so much to help transform these hearts as they're getting ready for the priesthood. And he's going to be right here on our doorstep. So I would encourage all of us to consider coming, to be willing to acknowledge our brokenness, to open our hearts, to have faith that Jesus can indeed bring healing. Let's be open to the ways that God might heal unexpectedly and just receive whatever it is that God has to offer for us. And even though there might be a danger of wanting just the healing and not actually Jesus, let's just be aware of it and just try to avoid that pitfall, but still come to the Lord. Bring Him your heart, your concerns, all of the brokenness. Jesus longs to bring healing into our hearts. And let's give Him that chance so that He can bring the healing touch that He wants for us and so that each one of us can live in the peace and in the joy that He created us for. Amen.